Hello, my name is Derek Silva, and I'm an Associate Professor of Criminology in the Department of Sociology at King's University College in Ontario, Canada. My areas of interest include terrorism and radicalization studies, policing and punishment, and increasingly exploring harms related to capitalist sport. My work can be found in the peer-reviewed journals Race and Class, Punishment and Society, Crime, Media and Culture, Sociological Forum, and others. And my public work has been published in outlets like Time Magazine, The Guardian, Jacobin, The Daily Beast, The Baffler, and The Chronicle of Higher Education. You can also follow me on Twitter at Derek Krim, and check out my podcast called The End of Sport, wherever you get your podcasts from. My sincere gratitude and thanks to my friend and colleague Yannick for asking me to briefly speak in this short video about radicalization prevention strategies. Yannick asked me to respond to the following important question. We've seen a lot of information on what terrorism is and the theoretical framework behind it, but we didn't really see much about how we can prevent radicalization. So I was wondering whether we could be provided with information about prevention strategies. I think this is a really great question, and one articulated quite well by my colleague Amarnath recently on Twitter, when he tweeted that everything we spend money on to stop radicalization and terrorism will probably at best do nothing, and at worst cause harm. And this is because all of the things that could have made a real difference have been underfunded, unfunded, or burned to the ground. This is a really important observation, and I think one that we as scholars of terrorism and radicalization need to seriously consider as we embark on our professional and research journeys. With all the money that governments across the world spend on so-called counter-radicalization, why do we continue to come up with ineffective and potentially harmful prevention strategies? And perhaps more importantly, how do we develop better prevention strategies that work more effectively and cause less harm? These are the questions that are really important, and they deserve a deep dive, but I'll do my best to talk about some of the things I have learned researching and working specifically in the area of counter-radicalization for the past decade or so. Part of the problem with this field, as articulated by Amarnath's tweet, is that there are a whole host of challenges preventing us from truly understanding how and why radicalization prevention strategies are successful, and perhaps even worse, that make it harder for us to understand when and how these strategies cause real and tangible harm to people. So before we get into talking about prevention strategies that might actually be effective, we have to first outline some of these challenges because they explain a lot about the current environment of counter-radicalization, also known in some circles as de-radicalization. The first problem is conceptual. Much of the research has focused on challenging the dominant tropes, binaries and dualities, and conceptual frameworks we use to understand so-called radicalization. A number of scholars, like myself, Arun Kundnani, Mark Sedgwick, Peter Newman, and many others have illustrated that the very concept of radicalization is fluid, dynamic, evolving, and even paradoxical, insofar that it seems to change meaning and take shape of whoever uses it. Even more, as my research has documented, the concept of radicalization has been adopted by powerful institutions like politicians, governments, and mass media to describe a very narrow and specific form of individual and group transitions towards political violence. That radicalization has become a discursive formation mobilized to mark so-called Islamic fundamentalist terrorism and associated transitions towards it. While this may in fact be changing, it has undoubtedly led to the emergence of a whole host of problematic governmental interventions that focus overwhelmingly on Muslim communities. For more on this, see Arun Kundnani's 2015 book, The Muslims Are Coming: Islamophobia, Extremism, and the Domestic War on Terror. So the first challenge facing radicalization prevention is that it's something of a moving target. It has become a heavily politicized concept that is embedded with meaning insofar as people now have a very specific and narrow understanding of the subject of radicalization. This ultimately also impacts the police government officials, intelligence officers, social workers, community leaders, prevention officers, and other key stakeholders who have a direct and explicit role in handling radicalization cases. We cannot and should not ignore the fact that our very understanding of and knowledge about radicalization influences who, what, where, and why we target specific populations for intervention. And indeed, we must also acknowledge that subsequent targeting may have a reverse effect on radicalization strategies. In other words, they might actually be a cause of rather than prevent radicalization. The second and related challenge to determining the efficacy of counter-radicalization interventions is that there is a great deal of secrecy behind their manifest activities. Governments, police agencies, and other vested groups are not keen to share information publicly, often because of issues related to so-called national security, but also because of their funding that's often tied to their ability to show efficacy of the program. But they do so through deploying their own metrics to justify their existence. These same organizations also have a vested interest in providing evidence of efficacy through metrics not publicly available and thus open to empirical scrutiny. In Canada, for example, Calgary's Redirect program, which is a counter-radicalization program within the Calgary Police Service that's in collaboration with community organizations, social workers, and community leaders, does not release case or even metadata to the public for scrutiny. So in short, there's very little opportunity to empirically assess the efficacy of many prevention strategies. The third and final challenge I'd like to speak to you briefly about is the challenge associated with creating counter-radicalization strategies with policing and surveillance at the core of their missions. As myself and others have pointed out, diverse Muslim and other racialized communities have been historically targeted by counter-radicalization programs through policing initiatives, mass surveillance, and other public policies. With policing and surveillance historically at the core of these initiatives, they have been top-heavy, inefficient, and problematic insofar as they trade catching very, very few people along the radicalization process in exchange for potentially harming the rest of the community. Further, law enforcement and policing agencies tend not to collect data associated with how their intervention might influence people negatively along the radicalization process. So it bears the question of whether or not counter-radicalization initiatives might actually be doing more harm than good. So with these challenges in mind, are there strategies that actually work? Well, in a book that I co-edited and which your professor contributed, preeminent psychologist of terrorism John Horgan and colleagues argued that counter-radicalization strategies can indeed work, but just not for everyone, and thus need to be carefully crafted with a number of social issues brought to the fore. In the same book, criminologist Kieran Hardy argues that radicalization prevention strategies need to center the harm principle in their formation. In other words, that counter-radicalization strategies should better understand how those interventions could be harmful to people consumed by the intervention, and in so doing will actually be better prepared to efficiently prevent terrorism. So short of a one-size-fits-all model of counter-radicalization that in many circles is the holy grail or the unicorn of strategies, we must grapple with the fact that counter-radicalization is more complex and will not work for everyone. There are, however, lessons that we can and should take from emerging scholarly interest in radicalization. This body of work suggests that prevention strategies that work have a number of key characteristics in common. First, they understand and work in partnership with communities rather than as an authoritative voice. It's not a top-down process where prevent officers, for instance, can go into communities and intervene in social life, but instead must be a collaboration. Second, they look at political violence and terrorism as symptoms of a broken social safety net system, as a matter of public health rather than a form of deviance or criminality. In so doing, they treat folks brought into the intervention as people, not criminals or people worthy of stigma. Third, they listen to local communities who have close knowledge about perceived grievances. Rather than thinking they have all the answers, they listen to community members who voice concern over their social environment. They also take grievances seriously, rather than brushing them aside. They deal with those often legitimate grievances rather than using the strong arm of the sovereign state to punish folks for deviating from normative expectations. They also decenter police, law enforcement, and surveillance from radicalization strategies. Of course, these are important, but they don't necessarily need to be at the core of the mission. If the goal is to de-radicalize people before violence occurs, then the assumption is that no violence has yet taken place. So the natural question is then, why would police or the criminal justice system who deal with crimes be centered? They also communicate where, how, and with whom they should. In other words, they use communication and open dialogue to attempt to shift focus away from political violence and towards political expression. In this respect, the work of Kurt Braddock and others on counter-narratives has been incredibly influential. The goal of these should not be sort of dogmatic propaganda, but rather to provide a counter-narrative to what folks would be hearing not explicitly directed at specific people, but in an area or media that can reach them nonetheless. In my decade or so of working in this area, I've yet to find a counter-radicalization strategy that has successfully done all of these things while keeping government funding and remaining sustainable over the long term. Indeed, this has led myself and others to question why governments continue to fund programs that have yet to show their efficacy. One reason for this might be that it's much easier to fund counter-radicalization projects that are at best kind of effective than it is to deal with the large problems that actually cause political violence. It's much harder to deal with the big issues plaguing society like rampant inequality, racism, imperialism and colonialism, and discrimination that are likely the main drivers of grievances that ultimately culminate in political violence. But that's an area that can be changed. The budding researchers of tomorrow, like yourselves, can work to better understand those drivers and create and inform social policies that take them seriously in order to prevent terrorism. I hope you all found this video helpful, and I appreciate the invite from Yannick to speak with you today. Again, my name is Derek Silva, and you can reach out to me on Twitter at DerekKrim. Have a great class.